Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin. And we have a real doctor on the show, Dr. Julian Ford from UConn, who is a psychologist and also a professor of psychology at the university. Welcome to our show, Julian.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Eric. Nice to talk with you.
Well, you couldn't be on at a better time, with the shutdown, with the coronavirus. Yes, it's taking a physical toll on people, but you must see the mental and psychological toll as well, don't you?
That's exactly right. Yep, it's hard on us in terms of stress just as much as it is a challenge medically and physically.
And what kind of stresses are involved? I mean, I would think, I always think about this pandemic as a tale of two cities. If you have a family, if you have significant others, it's going to be a lot different than being alone, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, one of the major stressors, of course, that I think we all know of is just isolation and loneliness and separation. And I think it's especially hard for those of us who don't have someone who we're actually living with, or even though sometimes that may be a four-legged family member, and that's just as important. But it's really tough, even if you have family there. And I guess maybe that's part of the tale of two cities, because for so many families where there are kids at home now, the parents don't have the break where the kids go off to school or in the next couple of months off to camp. So it's kind of like feast or famine. Sometimes you just can't get enough contact with other people because of the separation and the isolation and the sheltering in place and even quarantining. And sometimes you've got so much contact that it's a little overwhelming, even though it can be a wonderful time that will form many very, very positive memories once we get through it.
Interesting that you talk about, Dr. Ford, about four-legged friends and companionship.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, because sometimes that's underutilized or underreported.
Yeah, well, every time that I watch, for example, I tape, because I'm not up that late, and I watch the Late Show with James Corden, and almost always when he's talking to somebody, they've got a dog or a cat or some other family member who has four legs, and I've heard from so many people that the kind of unconditional love that you can get from many of those kinds of pet family members, and the challenge that you get from others like cats, that can actually be a wonderful way of having some companionship, but it doesn't replace the human connection. So I want to emphasize that. It's really wonderful and valuable, but we human beings just seem to need to see one another's faces and reach out and touch one another, and we just can't do the latter, and sometimes it's hard to do the former.
Before I throw it out to Eric, go ahead. I just had one more question. Is one thing that fascinates me, concerns me about this pandemic is, people's, or the human mind, and you would know a lot better than I would, in terms of if there's a definite ending, like you will be quarantined, you will be in this place for 1 month, 2 months. The human mind can kind of grasp that, I believe. You would know better than I would. But when it's kind of nebulous, doesn't that create its own problems?
Absolutely. I think you hit it right on the head. That not knowing when this is going to end, not knowing if it's going to end, and not knowing how it's going to end, and also not knowing whether it's going to appear to end and then come back again in another wave or several waves. I think all of that is just really ramping up our sense of uncertainty. And, when we're uncertain, and this is just a human condition, this is not because of any kind of mental health problem, but it can lead to some real distress. When we face uncertainty, and we also face some potential danger, even if it's not right there immediately, we always go right back to the kind of the natural survival mode, and that involves being very vigilant. Sometimes we even call it hypervigilance, where you just can't let down your guard. And I'm sure that's what you've seen and heard from people you've talked with, where sometimes it can involve just needing to keep track of everything on the news and getting overwhelmed by too much coronavirus news, and that can be it can almost be an addiction, not technically, but it can be something like that. But really what it is it's hypervigilance. It's trying to always be prepared, and that can interfere with sleep, as you can well understand. It can get right in the way of ordinary routines in life, and it can kind of lead us to start shifting and get off of routine. And what we know is that the most crucial kind of components or elements in coping with this kind of stress are, when you can't create certainty in some ways, create it where you can. And that's keeping with routines that are familiar or developing new routines. That's letting down your guard and relaxing and just not trying to be on guard all the time. But that's really tough to do. So I recommend it, but I also want to just absolutely say it's not as easy as just saying 1, 2, 3, I'm just going to relax and chill. I wish it was, but it takes a lot more effort than that.
Eric?
Yeah. I want to go back to what we were saying about the isolation. There has been, we've seen it on the news, there is a run literally on shelters to adopt animals. Now, here in the Northeast, it's not that big a deal. We actually, I'm on the board of directors of the Connecticut Humane Society. So here in the Northeast, we don't even have enough animals to adopt out to all the families that want them on a regular basis. Now people are flooding. In the South, they generally have a glut of animals, and they're clearing shelters now because people are just trying to find something, to overcome that isolation. Can you talk a little bit about what the effects of the isolation is, and why people are so it's so necessary for them to seek out the contact?
Absolutely. That's another great point. I think that it can be summed up in one word, and that is security. And by that, I do not mean objective security. I mean emotional security. There's something about being with another person or other people who we know, who we trust, who we feel close to, or just feel, a friendly relationship with. Doesn't have to be super close. There's something about that contact with other human beings that just creates a sense of inner security. And that's a major part of stress management for all the different ways that we sometimes try to teach relaxation skills and ways of thinking clearly so that you don't get trapped in thought patterns that kind of take you down into a real negative place. All of those skills that are very focused on what we can do as individuals are very important for stress management. But the major antidote for stress is contact with good people and good contact with good people. And sometimes that can involve four-legged friends as well. But again,
I'm sure it could.
And I think that's why I'm glad to hear that people are going to adopt animals, because I think that's a wonderful way to do not just the contact and the sense of connection, but that's also taking charge, taking some action, doing something good, doing a good deed, which is indeed very important, caring for another living being, which I think is really important. And that I should have said that also, that it's not just the security of knowing that you're cared for, it's the security of knowing that you have something that you can offer to another person or another living being that is valuable to them and that makes a difference to them.
I'd just like to remind our listeners. I'd like to remind our listeners that if you want to be part of the conversation, you can call us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693.
Awesome. Dr. Ford, how about you talk about your average person going through this stress. How about people that maybe have had underlying mental health issues to begin with? Doesn't this exasperate things?
It really can, yes. And I think that's something to take very seriously. But I know lots of people who have been dealing with depression and anxiety, and post-traumatic stress is one of the areas that I particularly work with. And many of those individuals are, on the one hand, they're really deeply affected because some of what's happening now can resonate with some of the troubles that they've experienced or even traumas that they've experienced in their life. So it can be very, very triggering. But on the other hand, what I've also seen is that so many of those folks they're so compassionate and they understand what it's like to go through this sense of uncertainty and anxiety and just feeling kind of disconnected and even a lot of sadness. So in many ways, they are the experts who have been preparing for this all along. And that doesn't make it any easier for them, but it actually means that in many cases, they are the role models for all of us as to how to be resilient in the face of this stress.
Have you actually encountered situations where these people have actually helped people that don't suffer from these illnesses?
Absolutely. Without going into any private details, I can think of several people who I've talked to, who I'm doing ongoing therapy with just in this week, who have reached out and done things, often things that they don't think are all that important, but when we talk about it, it becomes clear that they've done something that is really compassionate and that helps someone else who hadn't experienced this kind of stress or anxiety and for whom this is entirely new. And in some ways, they're kind of mentoring those of us who haven't been through some of those challenges. So
Interesting.
It's a wonderful, positive time. Again, not a happy time, and it's not a silver lining, but it's just something that I have such great respect for people who have had the courage to face emotional and psychological difficulties. And now they have so much to offer all of us.
Eric?
Yeah. Oh, we've been talking a lot about, dealing with this as, someone who's in quarantine, isolation. But I'd like to switch up a little bit and talk about the stress that the doctors and nurses are going through right now. I mean, they're literally going through things most of them never imagined. How does that stress cause problems for them and in turn also their families? I mean, we all know that stress is a killer, but we're talking about a kind of stress that most people have never seen before.
Absolutely, Eric. Again, you hit it right on the head. And the stress and the impact on frontline healthcare workers and really on frontline people who are out there in the stores, who are doing the deliveries, who are taking care of the hospital facilities. There are so many people. I guess we all know that it's particularly stressful and it is really potentially a very serious safety threat for the healthcare staff, professionals, and their teams who are working directly with patients who have COVID-19. And the effects are, again, they're very similar in some ways, and they're really different in other ways. these are people who are making a choice to be incredibly courageous and to take risks and serve others, and so they have a purpose, and I think that really is very sustaining. But they also have very legitimate fears. Are they going to have enough PPE, the protective personal equipment? Are they going to have enough ventilators? Are they going to have to make life and death choices? And they're also facing an almost constant onslaught of just noise and challenges and one incident after another. So where I was talking about vigilance and hypervigilance before, what I'm hearing from frontline folks is that they just really are sort of staying on guard all the time. And that makes it very difficult to let down, not only when they take a break, and sometimes they just will not take a break for hours at a time because they do not want to leave the work and leave their coworkers with that. But it also makes it incredibly difficult to let down when going home. And I've heard a lot from frontline workers about, they worry that, of course, they're going to bring the virus home, and they take incredible precautions, and they are exceptionally careful. And sometimes what it means is that they have to be isolated because they just can't go home, and they make a decision to not go home until they're not exposed anymore. Other times they have to go home. I talked to one frontline worker who has a 2-year-old daughter. Actually, I've talked to several who have very young children, and they can't not go home. They have to be with their child, even if they have another co-parent and caregiver. So I think what this does is it really basically, this is a very, very serious test of all of the broader public, the community, of our willingness to recognize that these frontline providers are basically they're stepping forward and taking care of all of us. And we need to be very, very thoughtful about the fact that they're going to need to not only have the supplies and the support now, but they're going to need it over the next several months and many years, because it's not something you unwind from easily. They're not necessarily going to have a disorder, but they're going to have a lot of post-traumatic stress.
Wow.
All right. If you'll just hang on one moment, we need to take a break and go to our sponsor. We'll be right back.
Hi, Chuck. Elmo wants to know, what is the census?
The census is a special time when we count every single person in the country.
Do kids and babies count, too?
Of course. Counting everyone in your home helps support your neighborhood by funding schools, hospitals, and more. So complete the census by calling, going online, or returning your form by mail. It's totally private.
Visit 2020census.gov and
make your family count.
Brought to you by Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Ad Council.
And we're back.
I'm Carnivore. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just want to remind our listeners that they can call in and be part of the conversation at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693.
Dr. Ford, this is Jeff. I had a thought that kind of interests me and might interest our listeners. The unfamiliarity of this whole situation, does that add to the stress? Like, there's people I know who have been laid off. You name what causes divorce, sickness. I'm not talking about terminal sickness, but all these things that kind of gives the average person stress. This thing is so new, so unfamiliar. Doesn't that add to the stress factor and potentially cause people to basically go places that they've never been before?
Well, I think we're all going places where we've never been before, Jeff. I think that's you hit it very accurately. And in doing that the sense of being out of our, the familiar and out of our comfort zone, I don't think that I know anyone who isn't experiencing that pretty much on a day-by-day basis. And when that happens, then it's a challenge. And it can be very exciting. I've heard, again, not to be all positive about this, but in the face of all the stress and the uncertainty and the losses that people are experiencing, losses of relationships in some cases, and just losses of the way of life and what's familiar, I've also heard so many people say that they created new connections, that they're doing things they hadn't done, they're reaching out to people they haven't been in contact with. I've had that experience too. People are getting together in very novel ways. Again, it doesn't replace the person-to-person, right there, face-to-face kind of human contact that we all long for. But it's very creative, and that's the thing that I'm seeing. Yes, the unfamiliarity, the uncertainty makes for anxiety, but it also is a really big spur for creativity, and that's the thing that I think most impresses me. I'm seeing so much creativity these days.
Does that really point to the human ability to adapt? I mean, this whole situation has never been encountered before in terms of, in recent history and people's experience or life experience. Yet, I'm amazed, and I'm obviously not a doctor, that how people have adapted. I mean, there's obviously, a huge downside, but people seem to have kind of risen to the occasion, haven't they?
I think that's exactly right. I see people every day who are rising to the occasion. Now, I think that it has to do with something really fundamental about handling stress that I think often gets overlooked, because we often think, well, if you want to deal with stress effectively, use your stress management skills like breathing and relaxation and mindfulness. And those are all really good, and they're really important. But what I've seen that really gets people through stress and actually can transform stress into an opportunity, even though not an easy one, is when people actually step back and reflect on not just, what do I want to do and what's today and what's on my schedule, but what are my core values? What do I really deeply believe in? And what do I want to bring into the world through my actions? And when people do that, I think they just really get to a very different place where it's possible to take something that's really difficult, like being separated from a loved one who has to be hospitalized and not being able to visit them when they're in a very serious situation. That kind of stress and the potential loss can be really demoralizing. And yet what I've seen and heard, well, I'll give you an example. I was talking to a colleague who said that he works actually in skilled nursing facilities. And as we know, older adults, especially those in that kind of facility, are particularly vulnerable both to the virus as well as to some of its worst effects. So he said that with all the challenges that they're facing, and he's a frontline worker, just as we were talking about, with all the challenges, what he remembered was one day where he was walking out, and as he was walking out to his car, he saw this older gentleman sitting on a bench, looking up into the window of one of the rooms in that facility, and he was having a meal. And he looked again and he realized that this was a man who was having dinner with his wife. He couldn't be in the room with her.
Oh, God. Wow.
He couldn't literally be right there with her, but he was going to have dinner with her, and they had dinner together. That's the kind of creativity where it comes from that fundamental sense of, what's my core value? I truly love this person. I'm going to be with her, and that's what I'm really committed to. When we get to that level, I think we start to make really good decisions. And we're not just reacting anymore. We're really, truly going on the basis of what we believe in. And that's where we make a difference. That gentleman did not only make a difference in his wife's life, but he made a difference in my colleague's life, because he sent my colleague home with a whole new, fresh appreciation that he took back to his family. And then he passed it along to me. So I'm glad I can share it with you.
Nice. Eric?
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And, constantly impressed by the creativity folks are seeing. I was actually speaking to some people the other day that initially they had canceled their wedding because obviously they couldn't get everybody together. And they decided they were going to go ahead with it. And the two of them were the only ones in the room, but they did it over a Zoom video conference. So all of their relatives and friends were at their computers, watching and cheering them on. And so even though they're separated, they're still, finding ways to make those connections, which I think goes a long way to what you were saying before about how important those connections are.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful example, and how wonderful for that couple that they didn't have to give up their dream. I actually know I know someone who actually officiated at a wedding just this past weekend, and that was another wedding that was supposed to have been canceled because of the pandemic, but they found a way. They did it with all the cautions about social distancing. And they had a really memorable wedding. And probably in some cases, these are going to be experiences where we'll remember and treasure them even more because we've had to basically face the adversity and not let it stop us from following through with what we believe is most crucial in our lives.
I actually agree with that 100%. I mean, although it won't be like a traditional wedding or bar mitzvah, it might make it even more special.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I'd like to, is there an exercise, a ritual, something that you can recommend to people that when they feel the stress getting to them, this is a good way to sort of step back and calm themselves down?
Sure. Well, everybody does it in their own unique way, but we have a way of teaching this that we call the SOS. So I'll share that with you very briefly. That, of course, it used to stand for Save Our Ships. It used to be the Universal Distress Call, but we've translated it now so that now the S means sweep your mind clear and slow down and just pay attention to what you're feeling in your body and just let your thoughts flow through your mind and just open your mind for a moment. And then the O is orient yourself to one thought that's whatever is most important in your life to you at this moment. And when people do that, they often picture a loved one, or they might think of something that they're going to do. I had a colleague who said, "Oh yeah, I love to orient to that desert island that I can go where there's no pager, no cell phone, I can just relax." But the orienting is going back and getting in touch with our core life goals. And then the second S is just a self-check. And here's where I think it's really useful to keep in mind. Everybody knows how to kind of do a stress thermometer where you say, how much stress are you feeling from 1 to 100, with 100 being the worst stress ever and 1 being none at all. That's good. And that's good to kind of check, what's your stress level? But we always say, it's not your stress level that matters. It's the other thing, and that's the other self-check that we suggest, and that's how much personal control do you have in your life right now? And the way we define personal control is not by the ability to make everything happen exactly the way you want, but the ability to think clearly based on your core values. So that's what we really rate. Personal control, if you got an 80 or a 90 on that, and you're thinking clearly and you're in touch with your core values, you're in great shape even if your stress is a 90. So I hope that's useful.
Oh, it's very useful.
Fantastic. Thank you
that is
so
really
much
great.
for being. Yeah, thanks
Can't
so much
thank
for
you
being
enough.
on the show with us. You've been listening to Carnivore Radio. You can catch us every Friday at 4 o'clock at blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. You can hear the replays as well as the Carnivore Bites recorded analysis. at xvadio.com/podcasts. You can also find the Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Eric and Jeff. Great talking with you.
Thank you.